January 19, 1991. High above the Saudi desert, just after 2 in the morning, an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft orbited at 32,000 feet, its massive 30-foot rotating radar dome turning silently against the blackness. Inside the pressurized fuselage, 19 Air Force crew members sat at their consoles, watching the screens as Operation Desert Storm entered its third night. The radar painted a picture of the entire sky for more than 250 miles in every direction, a transparent map where every aircraft, every movement, every threat appeared as a data point on the display. Iraqi Air Force commanders had spent months preparing their pilots, assuring them that speed and surprise would protect them from American fighters. They believed that if they flew low and fast, scattered their formations, and attacked at unpredictable intervals, they could overwhelm coalition defenses. They had confidence in their Soviet-built MiG-29s and Mirage F-1s, their training in asymmetric tactics, their knowledge of the desert terrain. What they did not know was that the instant any aircraft left the runway, an invisible eye in the sky had already marked it, calculated its vector, assigned an interceptor, and sealed its fate. The Iraqi pilots climbing into their cockpits that night believed they were launching into combat. In reality, they were flying into an execution. For years, adversaries of the United States had understood air warfare as a contest of speed, maneuver, and firepower. Fighter pilots trained for dogfights, for close-range knife fights at high altitude, for the moment when instinct and reflexes decided survival. Soviet doctrine emphasized numerical superiority in coordinated strikes, believing that enough aircraft launched simultaneously could saturate defensive systems and break through. Iraqi strategists adopted these principles, trusting that their pilots could exploit gaps in surveillance, evade radar coverage, and deliver strikes before the enemy realized they were airborne. They saw the vast distances of the Middle East as an advantage, a buffer zone where detection was slow and reaction times were long. They believed that American forces, stretched across multiple bases and reliant on ground-based radar with limited horizons, would struggle to coordinate responses in real time. Senior officers in Baghdad repeatedly assured their subordinates that American air power, while formidable, was not omniscient. The assumption was that if Iraqi fighters could get airborne and accelerate to combat speed, they would have the initiative. That assumption died the moment AWACS became operational over the theater. The E-3 Sentry was not a fighter. It carried no missiles, no guns, no offensive armament of any kind. It was slow, built on the airframe of a Boeing 707 commercial airliner, and required constant aerial refueling to remain on station. Its radar dome, while distinctive, was heavy and created drag, limiting the aircraft's performance envelope. Yet this ungainly platform became the single most important asset in achieving air dominance over Iraq. The reason was simple. It transformed the battlefield from a space of uncertainty into a space of absolute transparency. The ANAPY-2 radar housed inside that rotating dome was a pulse Doppler system capable of detecting airborne targets at ranges exceeding 320 kilometers, tracking them continuously and distinguishing between friendly and hostile aircraft with near-perfect accuracy. It could monitor hundreds of targets simultaneously, providing real-time data on altitude, speed, heading, and identification. Unlike ground-based radar, which was limited by the curvature of the Earth and could only see targets above the horizon, AWACS operated at high altitude, extending its radar coverage across entire regions. It could see over mountains, across borders, and deep into enemy airspace. Every fighter, every bomber, every transport aircraft in the theater appeared on its screens within seconds of takeoff. The Iraqi Air Force was no longer operating in the fog of war. It was operating in full daylight, and the Americans were watching everything. During Operation Desert Storm, coalition forces deployed 17 E-3 aircraft, 11 at Riyadh, 3 at Incirlik in Turkey, and additional aircraft from the Royal Saudi Air Force. They maintained continuous coverage over Iraq, flying overlapping orbits that ensured no gap in surveillance. Each AWACS mission lasted 8 to 10 hours, with mid-air refueling extending their time on station. The crews worked in shifts, monitoring the radar displays, coordinating with ground-based command centers, and directing fighter aircraft toward incoming threats. The system was integrated with Link 16, a secure tactical data network that allowed AWACS to share information instantly with F-15 Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-A-18 Hornets, and Patriot missile batteries on the ground. When an Iraqi aircraft was detected, AWACS controllers vectored the nearest fighter into position, providing precise range, bearing, and altitude data. The fighter pilot did not need to search the sky or rely on his own radar. He received direct guidance, often before the enemy pilot even knew he was being tracked. This coordination was so effective that during the entire air campaign, the coalition achieved a 36-0 kill ratio in air-to-air combat. 36 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed by American and coalition fighters. Not a single coalition aircraft was lost to Iraqi fighters in a dogfight. The imbalance was not the result of superior piloting alone, though American training was exceptional. It was the result of an information advantage so complete that Iraqi pilots were intercepted, engaged, and destroyed before they could react. They were flying blind while their adversaries could see everything. The radar capabilities of the E-3 were the product of decades of research into Doppler processing, signal filtering, and electronic countermeasure resistance. The AN/APY2 system used interleaving algorithms to operate in multiple modes simultaneously, switching between pulse Doppler non-elevation scan for wide area surveillance and pulse Doppler elevation scan to determine target altitude with precision. It could operate in beyond the horizon mode, detecting targets that were still below the radar horizon of ground stations. It included a maritime mode optimized for detecting ships and low-flying cruise missiles over water. The system was resistant to jamming, capable of filtering out electronic noise and isolating genuine targets even in contested electromagnetic environments. The radar dome itself rotated at 6 revolutions per minute during active operations, providing continuous 360-degree coverage. The data processed by the onboard computers was displayed on consoles inside the aircraft, where air battle managers analyzed the tactical picture and issued commands. These controllers had access to identification friend or foe systems that interrogated every aircraft in the sky, confirming whether it was a coalition asset or a hostile target. The AN/APX-103 interrogator provided instantaneous data on IFF status, range, azimuth, and elevation, creating a layered picture of the battlespace that left no room for ambiguity. When an unidentified contact appeared on the screens, the crew knew within seconds whether it was a threat. Iraqi pilots had no equivalent system. Their ground-based radar network was degraded by coalition strikes within the first hours of the war, leaving them with fragmented coverage and unreliable data. Their airborne radar systems, installed on MiG-25 interceptors and Mirage F-1s, had ranges measured in tens of kilometers, not hundreds. They could detect targets only at close range, and their ability to track multiple contacts simultaneously was limited. Worse, their command and control infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of precision bombing and electronic warfare. Communication between Iraqi air defense headquarters and fighter squadrons was disrupted, delayed, or jammed entirely. Pilots took off with incomplete information, relying on pre-mission briefings that were obsolete within minutes. They had no situational awareness beyond what they could see through their canopies or detect on their own sensors. By the time an Iraqi pilot acquired an American fighter on his radar, he was often already being tracked by an AIM-7 Sparrow or AIM-120 AMRAAM missile launched from beyond visual range. The engagement was over before it began. One of the most striking examples of AWACS effectiveness occurred on the night of January 26, 1991, when 2 Iraqi Air Force pilots attempted to flee to Iran in their MiG-23 fighters. They departed from an airbase in western Iraq, flying low to avoid detection, hoping to escape coalition air superiority and defect across the border. The moment they lifted off the runway, AWACS detected them. Controllers aboard the orbiting E-3 tracked their flight path, calculated their heading, and vectored a pair of F-15C Eagles from the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing into an intercept position. The Iraqi pilots had no warning. They were flying at high speed, focused on navigation and fuel management, unaware that 2 American fighters were closing on them from behind. The F-15 pilots received precise range and bearing data from AWACS, allowing them to position themselves for an optimal missile launch. Within minutes, both MiGs were shot down with AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. The Iraqi pilots never saw their attackers. They never received a radar warning. They simply ceased to exist, erased from the sky by an enemy they could not detect. This was not an isolated incident. It was the standard outcome of every engagement during the war. AWACS did more than coordinate air-to-air combat. It managed the entire aerial battle space, directing tanker aircraft to refuel fighters and bombers, guiding strike packages through complex ingress routes, and orchestrating combat search and rescue operations when coalition aircraft were shot down by surface-to-air missiles. The crews aboard the E-3 monitored the flow of hundreds of sorties each day, ensuring that aircraft did not collide, that tankers were available when needed, and that fighters had clear paths to their targets. They tracked cruise missiles launched from Navy ships in the Persian Gulf, confirmed their flight paths, and ensured they did not interfere with manned aircraft. They provided early warning when Iraqi fighters attempted to intercept coalition bombers, allowing escort fighters to engage and destroy the threats before they could reach their targets. The Sentry acted as the central nervous system of coalition air power, processing information from every sensor in the theater and distributing it to the units that needed it. Without AWACS, the air campaign would have been slower, more dangerous, and far less effective. With AWACS, it became a coordinated, overwhelming demonstration of technological superiority. The development of the E-3 AWACS began in the late 1960s when the United States Air Force recognized the limitations of ground-based radar networks. The program emerged from a requirement to detect and track Soviet bombers approaching North America, a mission that demanded coverage over vast distances and the ability to see beyond the radar horizon. Boeing competed against McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed in a grueling competition that pitted the 707 platform against the DC-8 and the EC-121. Boeing was selected in July 1970, and the first test airframe flew in February 1972. Westinghouse Electric Corporation was chosen as the radar contractor in September of that year, and full-scale development was authorized in early 1973. Engineering, testing, and evaluation began on the first E-3 Sentry in October 1975, and by March 1977, the 552nd Airborne Warning and Control Wing at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma received its first operational aircraft. The platform had taken less than a decade from concept to deployment, a remarkably short timeline for such a complex system. The speed of development reflected the urgency with which American military planners viewed the Soviet threat, and the recognition that airborne early warning was essential to countering it. The training required to operate AWACS was extensive and demanding. Crew members spent months learning to interpret radar displays, manage communications, and coordinate multiple aircraft simultaneously. The mission crew consisted of specialists in surveillance, identification, weapons control, electronic warfare, and battle management, each responsible for a specific function. Controllers learned to recognize patterns in enemy behavior, to anticipate threats before they materialized, and to make split-second decisions under pressure. They practiced in simulators that replicated the complexity of real-world operations, running scenarios that tested their ability to manage chaotic environments with multiple threats appearing simultaneously. NATO established a dedicated training squadron at Jalenkirchen Air Base in Germany to prepare multinational crews for the E-3 mission. This squadron trained an average of 250 aircrews per year, drawn from 13 alliance nations. The training was rigorous, designed to ensure that every crew member could perform their duties flawlessly even in the most stressful conditions. The investment in training paid dividends during actual operations, where AWACS crews consistently demonstrated exceptional competence and professionalism. If you appreciate discovering how classified technologies reshaped modern warfare, consider subscribing to Classified Warfare for future investigations into the systems that defined air dominance. Soviet military analysts who studied the Gulf War were stunned by the effectiveness of American airborne early warning. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union had developed its own AWACS equivalent systems, including the Bereev A-50 mainstay, which entered service in the mid-1980s. The A-50 was built on the Ilyushin Il-76 airframe and carried a rotodome radar similar in appearance to the E-3. However, its capabilities were significantly inferior. The radar had shorter detection ranges, less processing power, and fewer integrated data links. Soviet air defense doctrine relied heavily on ground-based radar networks and centralized command structures, not on airborne platforms that could operate independently and coordinate in real time. When Iraqi forces, equipped and trained by Soviet advisors, faced an adversary using AWACS, the limitations of Soviet doctrine became catastrophically apparent. The Iraqis could not compete in situational awareness. They could not coordinate their forces effectively. They could not exploit gaps in enemy coverage because there were no gaps. Every move they made was observed, analyzed, and countered before it could develop into a threat. Soviet military journals published after the war acknowledged that American airborne early warning represented a qualitative advantage that could not be overcome by numbers alone. One analysis noted that the ability to detect and track targets at extended ranges, combined with beyond visual range missiles and networked command systems, had fundamentally altered the nature of air combat. The traditional Soviet emphasis on large formations and saturation attacks was rendered obsolete by an enemy who could see the formations assembling, predict their routes, and destroy them piecemeal. Captured Iraqi Air Force documents and post-war interviews with surviving pilots revealed a consistent pattern of confusion and helplessness. Pilots reported that they received conflicting orders, incomplete threat assessments, and no reliable information about coalition aircraft positions. Some were scrambled to intercept incoming bombers, only to discover that by the time they reached altitude, the bombers had already struck their targets and departed. Others attempted to engage American fighters, only to be intercepted by aircraft they never detected on their own radar. Several pilots described moments when they realized they were being tracked, but had no idea where the threat was coming from or how to evade it. One Iraqi MiG-29 pilot who survived the war later stated that he had been trained to fight enemy aircraft he could see, but in Desert Storm, the enemy was invisible until the moment of impact. He described launching on a mission with full confidence in his aircraft and his training, only to be forced into defensive maneuvers by an unseen adversary who seemed to anticipate every move. He managed to evade and return to base, but the experience shattered his belief that skill and aggression could compensate for technological disadvantage. He understood in that moment that the Americans were not simply better pilots. They were fighting with information he did not have, and that information made all the difference. Another Iraqi pilot flying a MiG-29 described his mission on January 19, 1991, when he was scrambled to intercept what his ground controllers believed was a formation of British tornadoes. He took off from Al Walid Air Base carrying two R-27R semi-active radar-guided missiles and two R-60 Mk heat-seeking missiles, confident in his training and his aircraft. As he climbed to altitude, his radar detected nothing. Ground control provided updates based on fragmentary information from surviving P-19 radar stations, but the data was delayed and imprecise. He flew the assigned intercept course, searching for the tornadoes, unaware that AWACS had already detected his takeoff and was tracking his every move. Coalition controllers knew his position, altitude, and heading before he cleared the runway. They knew his aircraft type, his armament, and his probable intentions. They had already vectored F-15C fighters into position to intercept him if he became a threat. The Iraqi pilot eventually engaged a tornado using his radar-guided missiles, achieving one of the rare Iraqi air-to-air victories of the war, but his success was an anomaly in a campaign dominated by American information superiority. Most Iraqi pilots never had the chance to fire. They were intercepted and destroyed before they could acquire targets, victims of an invisible network that saw everything and forgot nothing. The technical specifications of the E-3 AWACS were classified for decades, but declassified Air Force documents and NATO operational reports have since confirmed the system's extraordinary capabilities. The radar could track up to 2,000 targets simultaneously, distinguishing between aircraft, missiles, and ground vehicles. Its maximum detection range for high-altitude targets exceeded 400 kilometers, and it could detect low-flying aircraft at ranges over 250 kilometers, depending on altitude and terrain. The onboard computer's processed radar returns in real time, applying filters to eliminate clutter from weather, ground reflections, and electronic jamming. The crew included specialists in air surveillance, weapons control, communications, and electronic warfare, each responsible for a specific aspect of the mission. The aircraft could remain on station for extended periods, typically 8 to 10 hours per sortie, and could be refueled in flight to extend its endurance indefinitely. During Desert Storm, some missions lasted more than 12 hours, with crews rotating through shifts to maintain constant vigilance. The physical and mental demands on the crew were significant, but the operational impact was undeniable. Coalition commanders had access to a god's-eye view of the battlefield, updated every few seconds with near-perfect accuracy. Iraqi commanders, by contrast, were operating in darkness, receiving information that was hours old, incomplete, and often contradicted by events on the ground. The impact of AWACS extended beyond the Gulf War. In the years that followed, the United States deployed E-3 aircraft in support of operations over the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq, again during Operation Iraqi Freedom. In each conflict, the Sentry provided the same overwhelming advantage in situational awareness. During NATO operations over Bosnia in the early 1990s, AWACS aircraft maintained continuous surveillance of the airspace, enforcing United Nations no-fly zones and monitoring Serbian military activity. Operation Deny Flight, which began in April 1993, relied heavily on AWACS to detect violations of the no-fly zone and to coordinate NATO fighters in intercepting Serbian aircraft. The presence of AWACS over Bosnia created a deterrent effect so powerful that Serbian pilots rarely attempted to challenge coalition air superiority. When NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force in August 1995, a sustained air campaign against Bosnian Serb forces, AWACS coordinated more than 3,500 sorties and ensured that strike packages reached their targets without interference. The precision and efficiency of the operation were made possible by the constant flow of information from AWACS to strike aircraft, fighter escorts, and command centers. In Kosovo during Operation Allied Force in 1999, AWACS again played a central role. The 78-day air campaign against Serbian forces required managing hundreds of aircraft operating in congested airspace, coordinating strikes against mobile targets, and protecting coalition aircraft from Serbian air defenses. AWACS provided real-time situational awareness, tracked Serbian radar emissions, and guided fighters toward targets identified by other sensors. The operation demonstrated that AWACS was not only effective in conventional air-to-air combat, but also essential for managing complex strike operations in contested environments. Serbian forces, having learned from NATO operations in Bosnia, employed tactics designed to minimize their radar signature and evade detection. They operated surface-to-air missile systems intermittently, activating them only long enough to engage targets before shutting down to avoid counterstrikes. Despite these tactics, AWACS maintained continuous surveillance, providing early warning when Serbian air defenses activated and allowing coalition aircraft to evade or suppress them. The system proved adaptable, capable of responding to evolving threats and maintaining air superiority even against adversaries who understood American capabilities and attempted to counter them. In Afghanistan, where mountainous terrain limited the effectiveness of ground-based radar, AWACS filled critical gaps in coverage. The aircraft supported Operation Enduring Freedom by monitoring airspace over the country, coordinating close air support missions, and tracking aircraft operating in complex environments where navigation and deconfliction were challenging. The presence of AWACS ensured that coalition forces could operate safely and that threats were detected early. In Iraq, during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, AWACS repeated its performance from Desert Storm, providing the situational awareness that enabled rapid air dominance. The Iraqi Air Force, having learned the lessons of 1991, chose not to contest the skies at all. Aircraft were hidden, dispersed, or buried to avoid destruction. Pilots refused to fly, knowing that doing so would result in immediate interception and destruction. The psychological impact of AWACS, combined with the memory of what happened in 1991, was enough to neutralize the Iraqi Air Force without a single engagement. The operational history of the E-3 includes thousands of missions across multiple theaters in peacetime and in war. During the Cold War, AWACS aircraft patrolled the borders of NATO airspace, monitoring Soviet aircraft and providing early warning of potential incursions. They tracked Soviet bombers conducting long-range patrols, intercepted reconnaissance flights probing NATO defenses, and maintained constant vigilance against surprise attacks. The presence of AWACS along the inner German border over the North Sea and in the airspace surrounding NATO countries created a defensive barrier that Soviet planners knew they could not penetrate without detection. This deterrent effect was as important as the system's combat capabilities, shaping Soviet planning and constraining their options during crises. The financial and logistical investment required to maintain AWACS capabilities is substantial. Each E-3 costs hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire, operate, and upgrade. The rotating radar dome requires specialized maintenance, and the aircraft's complex electronic systems demand highly trained personnel. Crews undergo extensive training to master the intricacies of radar operation, target identification, and battle space management. The logistical footprint of deploying AWACS includes tanker support, secure communication networks, and coordination with ground-based command centers. Despite these costs, the return on investment has been undeniable. The ability to prevent losses, coordinate strikes efficiently, and maintain air dominance in contested environments justifies the expense many times over. Military planners recognize that the alternative, operating without airborne early warning, would result in higher casualties, longer campaigns, and a greater risk of mission failure. The E-3 is expensive, but the price of not having it is far higher. Declassified documents from NATO and the United States Air Force provide detailed accounts of AWACS missions during Desert Storm and subsequent operations. Mission reports describe the coordination of strike packages, the vectoring of fighters to intercept Iraqi aircraft, and the management of aerial refueling tracks. After-action analyses highlight the precision with which AWACS controllers directed coalition forces, noting instances where multiple engagements were managed simultaneously without confusion or error. Crew debriefings reveal the intensity of the work, with controllers monitoring screens for hours, tracking dozens of aircraft, and making split-second decisions that determine the outcome of engagements. These documents confirm what was already apparent from the results. AWACS was not just a tool, but the foundation of American air superiority. The system worked as designed, and it worked flawlessly. Technological advancements continued to improve the E-3's capabilities long after its introduction. The Radar System Improvement Program, completed in the early 2000s, upgraded the AN/APY-2 radar with enhanced processors and software, improving its ability to detect small radar cross-section targets, including stealth aircraft and cruise missiles. The program also increased the system's resistance to electronic countermeasures, ensuring that it could continue to operate effectively in environments saturated with jamming and deception. The installation of next-generation identification friend or foe systems further improved target discrimination, reducing the risk of fratricide and increasing the speed at which hostile contacts could be engaged. These upgrades ensured that the E-3 remained relevant even as adversaries developed more sophisticated aircraft and sensors. The Sentry's longevity is a testament to the soundness of its original design and the continuous investment in modernization. As of the mid-2020s, the E-3 was still in service with the United States Air Force, NATO, and several allied nations, though plans were underway to eventually replace it with the E-7 Wedgetail, a newer platform with improved radar and avionics. The transition would take years, and in the meantime, the Sentry continued to perform the mission it had been designed for nearly 5 decades earlier, making the invisible visible and turning surprise into certainty. Adversaries who studied American air power after the Gulf War understood that defeating AWACS was essential to regaining any chance of aerial parity. Russian and Chinese military planners invested heavily in long-range anti-aircraft missiles designed to target AWACS and other high-value airborne assets. Systems like the S-400 and S-500 in Russia and the HQ-9 in China were developed with extended engagement envelopes specifically to threaten aircraft operating at high altitudes far from the front lines. The logic was simple. If AWACS could be destroyed or forced to retreat, the information advantage would disappear and the fog of war would return. However, destroying an AWACS in practice proved far more difficult than in theory. The E-3 operated deep within protected airspace, escorted by fighters, supported by electronic warfare aircraft, and shielded by layers of defensive systems. Any attempt to target it would require penetrating a heavily defended zone, and the AWACS itself would detect the incoming threat long before it arrived, allowing countermeasures to be deployed. The aircraft's defensive suite included radar warning receivers, chaff and flare dispensers, and in some cases, electronic countermeasures to spoof incoming missiles. More importantly, the doctrine of employing AWACS emphasized redundancy and survivability. Multiple aircraft were always on station, ensuring that if one was threatened or damaged, others could continue the mission without interruption. The loss of a single E-3 would be significant, but it would not cripple the overall system. This resilience, combined with the aircraft's operational flexibility, made it an exceptionally difficult target. The legacy of AWACS is not limited to the aircraft itself, but to the concept it pioneered: the use of airborne platforms to extend sensor range, integrate information from multiple sources, and coordinate forces in real time. This approach influenced the development of other systems, including the E-2 Hawkeye used by the United States Navy, the E-7 Wedgetail adopted by Australia and other nations, and various unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with advanced sensors. The principle of network-centric warfare, in which platforms share data seamlessly to create a unified operational picture, owes much to the lessons learned from AWACS operations. Modern air campaigns are built on the assumption that commanders will have access to comprehensive situational awareness, and that assumption is largely enabled by airborne early warning systems. The E-3 demonstrated that information dominance is not a luxury but a necessity, and that the side with better sensors and faster data sharing will almost always prevail. This understanding has shaped military procurement, training, and doctrine for decades, and continues to influence how air forces around the world prepare for future conflicts. The psychological impact of AWACS on enemy forces cannot be overstated. Knowing that every move is being watched, that every takeoff is detected, and that interception is inevitable creates a sense of futility that undermines morale and degrades combat effectiveness. Iraqi pilots during Desert Storm faced this reality every time they climbed into their cockpits. They knew the Americans had AWACS. They knew their chances of survival were minimal. Many chose not to fly at all, parking their aircraft or fleeing to Iran rather than face certain destruction. This was not cowardice, but a rational response to an insurmountable technological advantage. The same dynamic played out in later conflicts, where adversaries understood that contesting the skies against an opponent with airborne early warning was a losing proposition. The deterrent effect of AWACS extended beyond the immediate battlefield, influencing strategic decisions and shaping the calculus of escalation. Leaders who might otherwise have considered aggressive air operations reconsidered when they understood that their forces would be transparent to the enemy from the moment they launched. The Sentry did not just win battles, it prevented them from happening in the first place. The adversaries who underestimated AWACS paid a heavy price. Iraqi Air Force commanders believed their pilots could rely on speed, aggression, and tactical surprise to overcome American defenses. They were wrong. Soviet military planners believed that American technology, while advanced, could be countered through doctrine and numbers. They were wrong. The E-3 Sentry proved that information dominance is the ultimate force multiplier, that seeing first is as important as shooting first, and that no amount of courage or skill can overcome an enemy who knows where you are before you know where they are. The rotating radar dome atop the E-3 became a symbol of American technological superiority, a constant reminder that the skies were not neutral ground but a domain controlled by those with the best sensors, the fastest data links, and the most comprehensive situational awareness. Every aircraft that took off under the watch of AWACS was a known quantity. Every threat was cataloged, tracked, and neutralized. The enemy could not hide, could not surprise, could not win. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we continue to uncover the operations and technologies that kept adversaries in check and ensured that American forces entered every battle with the ultimate advantage, knowing everything while the enemy knew nothing.